Winter in the Middle Ages was not just a season, but a silent and invisible killer that came to every home uninvited. The icy wind pierced through everything, turning water into stone, and the only barrier between life and death was the walls of the home. People of that era had neither central heating nor modern insulation, but they possessed knowledge that we have lost. They turned the earth, grass, and wood into impregnable fortresses capable of retaining the slightest bit of heat inside. The engineering minds of that time worked to the limit of their capabilities, creating structures that seem primitive only at first glance. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price, expressed in hard work and centuries of experience, of simply building a roof over one's head in medieval Europe. What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval houses is not true? We are used to seeing tall wooden huts or stone castles, but to survive the bitter cold, the best solution was to burrow into the ground. The first and most effective type of winter shelter was the so-called Grubenhaus, or semi-dugout. People quickly realized that the earth retains heat much better than wooden walls, which are exposed to the elements. Even when a blizzard raged on the surface and trees cracked from the cold, the temperature remained stable above freezing at a depth of 1 meter. Construction began with digging a deep rectangular or oval pit, which became the foundation of the entire dwelling. This process required enormous physical effort, as the frozen or rocky soil had to be chiseled away with primitive tools. The excavated earth was not discarded, but laid around the perimeter of the future building, creating an additional protective embankment. Inside the pit, massive oak posts were installed to support the weight of the heavy roof. These posts were burned on a fire before installation to prevent the wood from rotting in the damp ground. The roof in such houses started practically from the ground, making the structure look like a large hut or hill. The absence of high walls minimized the area that could be attacked by the icy wind. The snow that fell in winter was not blown away by the wind, but settled on the gentle slopes in a thick layer. This snow cover became an additional free insulator that nature gave to man. Inside such a house, a thermos effect was created, where the heat from the hearth and people's breath was retained for hours. The entrance to such a dwelling was never made directly from the street in order to keep out the cold air. Builders constructed a long covered corridor or vestibule, which served as a thermal lock. The doorway was covered with heavy skins or several layers of thick felt fabric. People had to crawl or bend down to pass through this tunnel before entering the living area. This simple engineering solution blocked the icy drafts and kept the precious heat inside. The floor of a sunken dwelling was often covered with a thick layer of dry straw or reeds. This layer served as insulation from the cold ground, which, although it did not freeze, still drew heat away. The straw was changed regularly to keep it dry and prevent it from rotting due to moisture. In the center of the room was a stone-lined hearth, which served as the heart of the home. Smoke from the hearth rose upward and escaped through a small opening in the roof ridge. The walls of the pit were lined with wood or wattle to prevent the earth from falling into the living space. A small gap was left between the earthen wall and the wooden lining to allow air to circulate. This prevented dampness and mold, which were no less dangerous than the cold. The wood also served as additional insulation, making the walls less cold to the touch. Such houses were perpetually dim, as windows were rarely installed in order to conserve heat. Living in such a house required constantly maintaining a fire and monitoring the condition of the roof. Any leak or crack in the structure could render the dwelling uninhabitable. Moisture was the main enemy of sunken houses, so they were built only on high ground or in places with dry soil. Drainage ditches around the house carried away meltwater in the spring, saving the dwelling from flooding. It was a constant struggle against the forces of nature, where the slightest mistake was costly. Surprisingly, such houses could serve their owners for decades if they were properly maintained. Over time, the wood in the ground became as hard as stone, and the layer of turf on the roof grew into a single monolith. These were real bunkers, designed to survive the harshest winter. People felt safe under the protection of a thick layer of earth above their heads. The warmth of the earth was man's most reliable ally in the era, before electricity and gas. I'm very interested to hear your opinion. Would you agree to spend the winter in such a house for the sake of survival? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about a material that saved millions of lives, literally underfoot? When it was impossible to build dugouts due to groundwater, people erected above-ground walls using the mud wall technology. It was an ingenious composite material of the Middle Ages, combining the flexibility of wood and the heat capacity of clay. The frame of the wall was woven from flexible hazel or willow branches, creating a strong mesh similar to a basket. This wickerwork was light, but at the same time elastic enough to withstand wind loads. This wooden base was then covered with a thick layer of a special mixture prepared by the entire community. The mixture consisted of fatty clay, water, chopped straw, and, importantly, organic waste. The straw in this mixture acted as reinforcement in modern concrete, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. The clay provided wind protection and accumulated heat from the sun's rays during the day. The thickness of such walls could reach 30 centimeters, which created a reliable barrier against frost. The process of applying the mixture required tremendous patience and physical strength, as it was rubbed into the wattle by hand. It was necessary to fill all the cracks and voids so as not to leave a single chance for drafts. The walls were leveled and smoothed until they were relatively even and dense. After drying, this material became as hard as stone, but much warmer to the touch. Such a wall breathed, regulating the humidity inside the room in a natural way. For additional protection from rain and snow, the walls were whitewashed with lime on the outside. Lime not only gave the house a neat appearance, but also served as an excellent antiseptic. It protected the clay from being washed away by slanting rain and prevented the appearance of mold. The white color of the walls also reflected the faint winter light, making the space around the house a little brighter. Annual whitewashing was a mandatory ritual in preparation for winter. The vulnerable spot of such walls was the bottom, where they came into contact with damp earth or snow. To protect the structure from moisture, houses were built on stone foundations or high oak stilts. The stones were laid dry, without mortar, carefully fitting them together. This raised the clay walls above the level of snowdrifts and meltwater. Without such a foundation, the house could collapse in a single wet winter. Inside the house, the walls were often hung with woolen carpets or skins for additional insulation. The air gap between the wall and the fabric created another barrier against the cold. Clay walls had good thermal inertia. Heated by the hearth, they gave off heat for a long time at night. This allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained even when the fire in the hearth died down. Repairing such walls was simple and did not require expensive materials or the services of craftsmen. Any cracks could be filled with a fresh batch of clay mixed with straw. This made the dwelling very practical and easy to repair in conditions of limited resources. People did not depend on supplies of building materials. Everything they needed was provided by the surrounding nature. This construction technology was widespread throughout Europe and proved its effectiveness over centuries. Even in the most severe frosts, when birds froze in flight, life continued in such houses. The simplicity of the components concealed a deep understanding of the physics of materials. It was a triumph of human ingenuity over harsh climatic conditions. Clay walls provided reliable protection from the wind, but the main heat loss always occurs through the roof. You will learn how medieval builders solved the problem of roofing in the next chapter. Guess how long it took to create a roof that weighed several tons but was warmer than any blanket? The answer lies in the unique technology of turf roofs, which turned the house into an extension of the landscape. Instead of thin straw or expensive tiles, people laid layers of living soil with grass on the roof. It was an incredibly heavy option, but unmatched in its thermal insulation properties. A layer of soil 20 to 30 centimeters thick completely blocked the escape of heat to the outside. To create such a roof, a powerful rafter system was required that could withstand a colossal load. The thickest and strongest logs were selected, often using whole trunks of century-old trees. A continuous floor of boards or poles, tightly fitted together, was laid on top of the rafters. Then the floor was covered with a layer of birch bark, which served as an excellent waterproofing material. Birch bark did not rot for years and reliably protected the wood from moisture from the soil. The turf was cut into strips or squares in the meadows, trying to keep the root system of the plants intact. These pieces were laid with the grass side down, directly on the birch bark, and the second layer was laid with the grass side up. Over time, the roots of the grass sprouted through the layers, binding the entire structure into a single carpet. Such a roof lived its own life. In summer, it turned green, and in winter, it was covered with dry grass. It was a real ecosystem on top of a human dwelling. In winter, the dry grass and layer of soil acted as a giant cushion, trapping warm air. When snow fell on such a roof, it did not melt from the heat of the house, which indicated perfect insulation. The snow cover became another layer of insulation, making the house even warmer. Inside such a roof, it was always quiet, with the sounds of the blizzard outside reaching only as a dull hum. However, this design required a specific roof pitch. A roof that was too steep would cause the heavy turf to slide down under its own weight. A roof that was too flat could collapse under the weight of wet earth and snow. Builders found the perfect balance, honed by centuries of trial and error. The edges of the roof were reinforced with special logs or stones to prevent the turf from crumbling. Special plants with strong root systems were often planted along the edge to reinforce it. Such a roof required maintenance. Sometimes it was necessary to reseed the grass or remove sprouting trees. But in general, it lasted for decades, requiring only minimal attention. Interestingly, such roofs were fireproof, unlike straw variants. Wet soil and green grass could not catch fire from an accidental spark from the chimney. This was a huge advantage in wooden settlements, where fires destroyed entire villages. Safety and warmth were the main criteria for choosing this technology. Turf roofs perfectly blended the dwelling into the surrounding landscape, making it inconspicuous. But their main function was to preserve the lives of the inhabitants during deadly cold spells. It was an example of the ideal symbiosis between man and nature. Please like this video if you are also amazed by the ingenuity of our ancestors. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about survival in the Middle Ages. The builders of the northern lands and Scandinavian settlements knew as much about the wind as experienced sailors. Their houses were born from the same logic as the ships that plowed the harsh northern seas. Longhouses were not simple rectangular barns, as we sometimes imagine. They had a characteristic smooth shape, reminiscent of an inverted ship's hull, which immediately caught the eye of an attentive observer. The walls did not stand vertically. They curved slightly outward, and the roof formed an elongated, streamlined ridge. This was not a decorative gesture, but a solution born of centuries of observation and struggle against the elements. Strong winds hitting a flat wall create an area of high pressure. Such a house loses heat rapidly. The air blows it out of the smallest cracks, turning the dwelling into a cold barrack. But the curve of the wall forced the wind not to hit the surface, but to glide gently along it. The airflow encountering this shape seemed to cling to the house and move away without creating powerful eddies. As a result, the wind load was reduced many times over, and the heat remained inside even on those nights when storms shook the entire fjord. The house literally dived under the gusts, like a boat lifting its bow toward a wave. The initial orientation of the house on the terrain was no less important than its design. The builders knew the wind rose and carefully chose the direction of the long axis of the building. They placed the narrow end facing the prevailing wind, minimizing the impact area. This reduced wall icing and heat loss. Entrances were never placed on the inside. Doors led to the side facades, which were naturally protected from direct gusts. This approach prevented the interior from cooling down every time someone entered or left the house. The interior layout of the longhouse was subject to the same logic of rationality. There were no partitions inside, forming a single elongated room. This ensured free air circulation and even heat distribution. The central hearth served as the heart of the house. It provided warmth, light, and a dry microclimate, which was necessary in the humid northern air. Low side walls and a high ridge formed an optimal volume. The heat did not have to rise too high, but it did not escape immediately under the roof, lingering under the slopes. The roof frame itself was a marvel of engineering intuition. The load-bearing structure was based on curved beams that started almost at ground level and rose to the ridge, creating a strong and stable foundation. The weight of wet straw, log beams, or turf roofing, as well as hundreds of kilograms of snow in winter, was transferred directly to the ground. The walls, meanwhile, served only as barriers. They did not bear the main weight, which allowed them to be built from lighter materials: turf, thin wooden elements, and sometimes stone. Wall materials could vary greatly from region to region. Where forests were abundant, wood was used: logs, boards, poles. In treeless areas, stone was used to build massive walls with dry masonry without mortar. The thickness of such walls could reach 2 meters, turning the house into a giant heat accumulator. Inside, such walls slowly gave off heat, and outside they kept the cold out perfectly. But regardless of the material, the general shape of the house remained unchanged: elongated, streamlined, squat. The floor in long houses was most often earthen or adobe. Sometimes it was slightly raised at the edges to prevent water from flowing down the walls. Along these same walls, wide benches were arranged, which served as both a place to sleep and a work surface. This was an ingenious solution. The sleeping places were located above floor level in a warmer area. Cold air, as we know, sinks, and no one slept at the lowest point of the room near the ground. The inhabitants stayed where the air was warmed by the hearth. The architecture of longhouses is not accidental or improvised. It is the result of hundreds of years of evolution, adaptation, and collective experience. Every bend in a log, every stone in a wall, every line of a roof spoke of an understanding of the climate, the landscape, and the physics of wind. Such houses were not just dwellings. They were mechanisms fine-tuned for survival in the harsh conditions of the north. But no wall shape or house orientation could fully protect against the cold without a reliable source of heat inside. The architects of the past understood that it was important not only to retain heat, but also to produce it correctly. In the next chapter, we will examine how the inhabitants of northern regions heated these huge spaces without pipes, fireplaces, or modern heating systems. At the center of any medieval dwelling designed for wintering was always an open hearth. It was not just a place for cooking, but the only source of heat and light. The hearth was located strictly in the middle of the living space so that the heat would spread evenly in all directions. Usually it was a small depression in the earthen floor, lined with flat stones. The stones heated up and continued to radiate heat even after the fire had burned out. The main problem with an open hearth was the lack of a chimney as we understand it today. The smoke rose up to the very top of the roof and accumulated there in a thick layer. A special opening was left in the roof for the smoke to escape, often covered with a movable damper. This system did not work perfectly. The house always smelled of smoke and soot. However, it was this smoke that played an unexpected role in retaining heat. The layer of warm smoke under the ceiling created a kind of air plug that prevented heat from escaping. The smoke saturated the thatched or wooden roof, preserving the materials and protecting them from decay and insects. The soot that settled on the beams made them more resistant to fire. Living in smoke was hard on the eyes and lungs, but it was the price to pay for warmth. People preferred to cough rather than freeze to death. Not only wood, which was a valuable resource, but also peat was used for fuel. Peat burns slowly, giving off an even and long-lasting heat, ideal for nighttime heating. In treeless areas, they even used dried manure, which burned as well as peat. Preparing fuel for the winter was the main task of the entire summer and fall. The whole family's life in winter was centered around the hearth. This is where they cooked, did crafts, dried clothes, and slept. The closer to the fire, the higher the status of the family member or guest. Old people and children always took places in the first circle of warmth. Sometimes a large pot of water was hung over the hearth, which also acted as a heat accumulator. The hot water cooled slowly, giving off heat to the surrounding air and humidifying it. This helped to combat the dry air that occurred during severe frost. The humid air felt warmer and was better for breathing. Special attention was paid to controlling the draft so as not to cool the house through the smoke hole. During strong winds, the hole was partially covered to regulate the airflow. This required experience and constant attention, especially at night. Carbon monoxide was a silent killer, so ventilation was vital. The hearthstones were carefully cleaned and sorted, replacing those cracked by heat. Ash was not simply thrown away, but used as insulation for walls or for washing. In a medieval household, nothing was wasted. Everything served the purpose of survival. Fire was the sacred center of the home, its soul and protector from the icy darkness. The ability to handle fire and keep it burning was the main survival skill. Without this fiery heart, even the thickest walls would turn into an icy tomb. The hearth provided warmth, but outside the house was attacked by tons of snow and ice. We will look at how people turned snow from an enemy into an ally later on. Are you ready for the shocking truth that snow actually keeps you warm? We are used to clearing snow around our homes, considering it a source of cold and dampness. A medieval resident, seeing modern snow removal, would consider us crazy. They knew physics intuitively. Fresh, loose snow is 90% air, and still air is one of the best heat insulators in nature. As soon as the first heavy snow fell, the inhabitants did not clear it from the walls, but on the contrary, threw it onto the house. They created high snow mounds that covered the walls up to the roof. This was called a zavalinka, but in the winter version, it consisted of compacted snow. Such a snow embankment completely prevented the wind from blowing through the walls. The temperature of the wall under the layer of snow became significantly higher than in the open air. Snow on the roof was also a welcome guest, if the structure could withstand its weight. A half-meter thick layer of snow acted as a down blanket for the entire house. It covered the gaps in the roof through which precious heat could escape. People anxiously awaited snowfalls if the beginning of winter was snowless and frosty. A bare winter was the most terrible test for a dwelling. Inside the snowdrift surrounding the house, the temperature rarely dropped below 0 degrees, even if it was -30 outside. This created a buffer zone between the fierce cold of the street and the warmth of the house. Mice and small rodents also understood this, digging tunnels in the snow insulation. The snow turned the house into a natural den, protected by the laws of thermodynamics. However, in the spring, this protection became a threat when the snow began to melt. Therefore, it was important to clear the snow from the walls in time when the first warm weather arrived. If the moment was missed, the meltwater could go under the house and flood the earthen floor. This required careful observation of the weather and the calendar. In areas with particularly strong winds, woven shields were erected to retain snow. They were positioned so that the snow carried by the wind would settle around the dwelling in the desired manner. It was a passive system of controlling the elements that did not require human effort. The wind itself built protective bastions around human dwellings. Passages to farm buildings were dug out in the form of trenches with high walls. These snow corridors also protected people from the wind when moving around the yard. The entire yard was transformed into a labyrinth dug into the thick snow. Life went on as if in another dimension, hidden under a white blanket. Snow was also used to temporarily seal window openings or cracks. A crack filled with dense snow did not let the wind through and quickly froze, becoming monolithic. It was a free and always available sealant for emergency repairs. Nature itself provided the materials to protect against its wrath. The use of snow as insulation is a striking example of human adaptation to the environment. Instead of fighting the snow, people made it part of their architecture. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation as a guarantee of survival. In the next chapter, you will learn how people organized sleeping areas inside these shelters to survive the coldest hours of the night. When the fire in the hearth burned out by morning, the temperature in the house began to drop rapidly. To keep from freezing in their sleep, medieval people invented a unique piece of furniture, the box bed. It was not just a bed, but a real house within a house, a cabinet with doors. The design was a completely enclosed wooden box with thick doors or curtains. Inside such a box, a microclimate was created that kept the sleeping people warm. The dimensions of such a bed were modest, and people often slept in it in a semi-sitting position. This was done not only out of superstition, but also to save space and heat. In a small space, the air heated up faster from the warmth of the human body. Often, several family members slept in one such bed, warming each other. Cramped quarters were the key to survival on freezing nights. The bottom of the bed was lined with a thick layer of straw or hay, which was changed several times during the winter. Woolen blankets or animal skins were placed on top of the straw if the family was wealthy. Goose down duvets were a luxury available to few, but they provided the best warmth. Poor people covered themselves with old clothes and buried themselves in the straw up to their heads. The wooden walls of the box protected sleepers from the drafts that blew through the house. Even if the temperature in the room dropped to 0, it remained comfortable inside the box. The cracks in the boards were caulked with moss or cloth to make the structure airtight. It was a capsule of life, isolated from the outside environment. Such beds were often placed near the hearth or the warmest wall of the house. A place for young domestic animals, lambs or piglets, could be arranged under the bed. The heat from the animals rose upward, additionally warming the sleeping area from below. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement in the harsh conditions of winter. During the day, bedding was aired out by the fire to get rid of dampness. Moisture released by the body during the night could make the straw damp and cold. Dry bedding was critical to maintaining good health. This ritual was an essential part of the morning routine. Sometimes stones heated in the hearth and wrapped in cloth were placed inside the bed. These peculiar hot water bottles gave off heat for several hours, helping people fall asleep in warmth. Copper or ceramic hot water bottles with coals were also used, but they were a fire hazard. Stones were a more reliable and safer option. Box beds were often decorated with carvings and were the most valuable pieces of furniture in the house. They served not only for sleeping, but also for privacy in a crowded dwelling. It was the only personal space a person had in the cramped world of a medieval home. This sleeping system allowed people to survive nights when the outside temperature dropped to extreme levels. People created a multi-layered protection: the walls of the house, the warmth of the hearth, and finally the walls of the bed. Each layer played its part in the battle for warmth. A special frame was required for the roof to withstand tons of earth and snow. Medieval builders understood perfectly well that ordinary straight beams could not cope with such a load. The wood could crack under the weight and the roof could collapse, so the approach had to be thought out in advance. People looked for materials that were naturally strong. This required long hours of work in the forest and a deep knowledge of nature. Medieval carpenters used a technique known as curved log framing, or crack. It was a unique technique that arose from observing how trees grow. Oaks bent by the wind or sun had a natural shape that was ideal for load-bearing structures. Carpenters knew where such trees were more common and went there specifically. This approach allowed them to use natural geometry. They searched the forest for oak trees that had naturally curved trunks. These curves were important because they replicated the line of the future arch. Finding the right tree was a matter of luck and experience, as there were few suitable trunks. People spent hours walking around the forest and assessing the shape of each oak tree. This is how the construction of a future house began. Such a trunk was sawn lengthwise into 2 halves, resulting in 2 mirror image pieces. Sawing was delicate work that required precision and strong hands. The 2 halves had to be identical, otherwise the structure would lose its stability. The craftsmen worked slowly so as not to spoil the material. The resulting pieces were then transported to the construction site. Joined together in the shape of the letter A, they formed an incredibly strong arch. This arch became the central element of the frame. Its strength lay in the fact that it replicated the natural shape of a tree, which meant it could withstand enormous loads. This approach made it possible to build roofs capable of supporting a thick layer of earth. The house was warm and durable. These arches were installed on the ground and bore the entire weight of the roof. The structure distributed the load in such a way that the walls were practically not under any pressure. This made the walls a secondary element that could be made of lightweight materials. The house became stable, even if the walls were thin. This construction principle was popular in various regions of Europe. The load was not placed on the walls, which could spread apart, but vertically down into the ground. This was a solution based on observing nature, where trees transfer their weight to their roots. People copied this logic, creating structures similar to living organisms. The ground took on the force of gravity, and the frame only directed it downward. Thanks to this, the structure was almost completely free of deformation. This made it possible to build walls from lightweight materials such as wattle and daub. Woven panels were easy to replace or repair when damaged. They did not play a load-bearing role, so they did not require great strength. The house looked simple, but the frame inside was a real marvel of engineering. This approach saved materials and time. The skeleton of the house stood firm, like a tree rooted in the ground. People felt this stability and trusted their buildings even in severe weather. For many centuries, such houses protected entire families from the cold and wind. They could stand for decades without serious repairs. This proves the correctness of the chosen construction method. This design was not afraid of hurricane-force winds and snowfalls. The arches distributed the pressure so that it was difficult for gusts to destroy the house. Even heavy winter snows, which could lie for months, posed no threat. The wind only slid over the sloping roof, finding no weak spots. This made such houses ideal for the northern climate. The parts were joined without a single iron nail, as metal was expensive. Metal was reserved for weapons and tools, not for construction. Therefore, carpenters created fastenings entirely from wood, using skills passed down through generations. Such joints were strong and durable. This required skill but gave excellent results. Even if the ground under the house swelled slightly from the frost, the frame withstood the deformation. The foundation stones helped to distribute the load evenly. The house seemed to rise and fall with the ground without losing its stability. This was important in regions where winters were long and harsh. People knew this feature of the land and built accordingly. No matter how well thought out a design was, it could not save a house if it was built in the wrong place. Medieval builders understood well that the choice of site was the foundation of the entire dwelling, and a mistake here would result in years of cold, disease, and endless repairs. People of that era had an amazing sense of climate. They knew that cold air, like water, flows into lowlands, settles in ravines, and lingers there for long nights, turning these places into real frost pockets. A difference of a few degrees could mean the difference between a warm home and an icy trap. Therefore, dwellings were almost always built on slopes, preferably south-facing, to catch every ray of the weak winter sun. The orientation of the entrance was no less important than the location of the house itself. The door was most often turned to the south or southeast, exposing it to the morning sun and protecting it from the north winds. The north side was considered harsh and hostile. Windows or doors were rarely made there. This wall acted as a natural shield, taking the brunt of the cold. Thanks to this orientation, the threshold stayed dry longer, the snow melted faster, and the house remained protected from the damp wind that could rush in every time the door was open. Builders of the past skillfully used the features of nature. Where the terrain created natural shelters, they built houses under the protection of rock ledges, low hills, or dense groups of trees. The forest served not only as a source of wood, it calmed the wind, reduced its speed, and made the climate around the settlement milder. A lone tree could serve as a landmark in the forest, but it was dangerous for a house. A storm could knock it right onto the roof. Therefore, people settled under the cover of several trees, but avoided those that were too old or leaning. Choosing the right place was half the battle in the fight against the cold. It was a true strategy of passive survival, using the power of the landscape as actively as the power of wood or stone. People did not try to bend nature to their will. They integrated themselves into it and made it their ally. And it was thanks to this wisdom that their homes withstood centuries of harsh climate. We have seen that medieval dwellings were not just piles of logs and straw, but complex engineering systems. From the floor sunk into the ground to the ridge of the turf roof, each element served a single purpose: to preserve life in deadly cold conditions. People used the geothermal heat of the earth, the aerodynamics of shape, and the properties of snow and moss to create effective thermoses without a single modern material. Their wisdom was paid for by centuries of experience and mistakes, each of which could cost the life of an entire family. Nowadays, when we are used to regulating the temperature with a single turn of the thermostat, this knowledge seems archaic, but it reminds us of the incredible ability of humans to adapt and find solutions in the most desperate situations. Perhaps in an era of ecological crisis, we should take another look at these forgotten technologies of harmony with nature. Which ancient technologies surprised you the most? Would you like to learn more about how food was stored in such conditions so that it would not spoil or freeze? Write your suggestions in the comments and subscribe to the channel to continue your journey into the history of survival.